Welcome to Radical AI, a podcast about technology, power, society, and what it means to be human in the age of information. We are your hosts, Dylan and Jess. And in this episode, we interviewed Dr. Su Lin Blodgett about definitions of bias in natural language processing systems and beyond. How do we define bias? Is all bias the same? How does bias impact the stakeholders of natural language processing systems? Is it possible to eliminate bias completely in our AI systems? Should we?
Su Lin Blodgett is a postdoctoral researcher in the Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and Ethics, otherwise known as FATE, group at Microsoft Research Montreal. She is broadly interested in examining the social implications of natural language processing, or NLP, technologies, and in using NLP approaches to examine language variation and change. Su Lin previously completed her Ph.D. in computer science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst.
This was a really exciting conversation for us to have because last summer, so in the summer of 2020, we had the opportunity to interview Dr. Emily Bender, who is an amazing scholar in the field of natural language processing. And we had an episode with her on basically the 101 of NLP ethics. And so we see this conversation as a continuation of that dialogue where we dive a little bit deeper into some of those topics that we brought up with Emily, especially on this topic of bias. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. So we are so excited to share this conversation with Dr. Su Lin Blodgett with all of you. Today we are on the line with Su Lin Blodgett. Su Lin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And today our topic of interest is bias and the power of definitions and language. So why don't we kick it off with our first question for you, Su Lin, which is, in your own words, how do you define the word bias?
Oh man, what an impossible and good question. So for me, there is no single definition of this, and the NLP community has approached this in a lot of different ways. So maybe it would be helpful for me to illustrate some of those. So first I should say, before I get to thinking about this, a lot of work has emerged in the NLP community thinking about this in the last few years. So even though we have a long way to go, I want to acknowledge all the work that people are putting into this right now and to say it's really exciting to see significant emerging awareness of, quote unquote, bias in NLP. So for me, what I'm seeing is that in many ways, in NLP, bias has come to refer really broadly to just undesirable system behaviors. And what you find when you dig in is that researchers and practitioners actually really mean a whole bunch of different things when they say bias. And I'll give some examples. So for example, in sentiment analysis, where the goal is to predict the sentiment of a piece of text, for example, if it's positive or negative or neutral, researchers have found that systems give different predictions for sentences with names associated with different genders. So for example, Amanda feels anxious because Adam feels anxious. And the same is, and they get different predictions for how positive they are even when they really shouldn't, because they're basically the same sentence. And the same is true for names associated with being African American versus European American. So elsewhere, toxicity detection systems, where the goal is to predict whether a piece of text is toxic or offensive, right? So they treat sentences that mention disability as toxic even when they shouldn't. So for example, the sentence, I am a deaf person, or I am a person with mental illness, gets high toxicity scores, right? Even though they're plainly not toxic sentences. Automatic captioning systems exhibit higher errors for people speaking in accents or language varieties that aren't mainstream US English, for example, speakers from Scotland. And one last example, and these are all awful examples, but this one is particularly awful. Some large state-of-the-art language models like GPT-3 produce very harmful ideas about different people. So it's been shown that when given prompts referring to Muslims, GPT-3 almost always generates text talking about terrorism. And when given prompts referring to, say, a transgender woman, we've seen it generate text talking about how she's not really a woman. So I think all these examples are sort of illustrative because we can see that when we as a field say bias, we really are referring to quite a wide range of different system behaviors. And really because language is connected to identity in our social world in so many ways, right? And this comes out in how we think about bias. So sometimes we're talking about issues in how NLP systems treat language about or describing different people. For example, horrifically Islamophobic or transphobic ideas. Sometimes we're thinking about how NLP systems treat names associated with different groups. Sometimes we're thinking about how NLP systems treat language produced by different groups of people, right? Like with the automatic captioning. Sometimes we're concerned, sometimes bias means that a system is exhibiting different error rates for different kinds of language. Sometimes bias seems to mean that we are treating certain kinds of language differently. So however positive my system thinks Adam is anxious is, we're giving a different prediction for Amanda is anxious. Sometimes it means that systems are just, producing certain kinds of language at all that we think are harmful, right? So I think bias has come to kind of encompass like a whole wide range of kind of different things, system behaviors, properties that we find undesirable.
So I'm curious why this matters, right? So we talk about bias, right? I'm not challenging that this matters, but I'm curious from your perspective, right? Like how we talk about bias obviously changes how we might implement certain design decisions around that bias. But from your perspective, like why is this, what you research, and like why does this really matter out in the world?
Right. That's an important question. So from my perspective, the language that we use to describe things really is important because it shapes how we think about, right, and address these things. So I think there's two places this happens, right? One, being really precise about what we think is harmful helps us reason about the harms more, right? So just in terms of what we want model behavior to look like, what we think is harmful, who might be harmed, right? The more precise we can be, the more kind of carefully we can reason about these. And it also helps because the more precise we are, the more we're able to draw on all this work outside NLP that has thought about these things for a long time, right? So language is involved in our social world, right? And it's deeply, like these contexts are really deep, and people have thought about these for a very long time. So the more careful we are, the more precise we are about these mechanisms, the more we can also draw on all this work. And also, the more precise we are, the better we can think about how we are like measuring or mitigating these things, right? I mean, if you say racial bias, right, this doesn't really help you think about how good is the way, is the way that I'm measuring racial bias really what I'm after? Is the mitigation really what I'm after? Are there aspects of this that I'm not capturing effectively through my choice of measurement, right? And I think being very precise and saying, I'm after stereotyping, I'm after just performance differences, I'm after the erasure of certain topics or perspectives, right? Like that allows you to be quite precise about like normatively what you think the harm is, and also how good of a job you think you're doing at measuring or mitigating.
You keep using the word measuring, which is something that Dylan and I have been focusing on a lot lately. We have a new series called Measure Mentality. And so we were thinking about this in the context of bias before this interview.
Ooh, that's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, you should definitely check it out. Also, other listeners, shameless plug.
Yes, I will.
Yeah. But something that I'm wondering with the measurement of bias, because you are talking about the importance of precision and, I guess somewhat standardization and a common definition. And so I'm wondering, do you think that first is it possible for there to be a common definition for something like bias in NLP? And if so, is that good or bad?
That's a good question. And I think there's a couple of things I want to draw out from that. So one is that I don't think we need a single way to describe bias, right, or a consensus, because what we're finding, right, when you dig into all the ways people think about bias, is that is that the language we need more precise language, or we need language that is more precise than bias to describe each of these things, because they're about different groups of people, different kinds of language, different kinds of model behavior that we're worried about, how to specify, right? So this variety should encourage us to be more granular and more precise, rather than to come up with one single overarching way to describe all of it at the same time, because that's just not possible, right? Social groups are not exchangeable, right? The different harms that people might experience are not really the same, and so we should have the vocabulary, right, the ways to think about that are not, just bias. But at the same time, I think this measurement aspect, right, is useful, and there are things that we can draw on to kind of unify in how we talk about this. For example, one thing that I do a lot in my work is to draw on kind of framework of measurement modeling from quantitative social sciences, right, which offers some language for carefully thinking about. It's really like a framework for thinking about what it is you want to measure. So in this case, we're worried about bias or harms, and how good of a job you're doing at measuring it. And so this doesn't really say this is the one way to measure bias, this is the one way to think about bias, but it does offer you a language for very carefully thinking through what it is that you're after and how good a job you are at capturing what it is that you're after, right? And this kind of vocabulary, right, can help us as we're, publishing these approaches, they're trying to put them in practice, like really compare them against each other and have like this kind of shared vocabulary in a useful way.
There was this idea that was in vogue a few years back, and maybe still is, that bias is bad, and therefore the goal of our algorithms should be to mitigate that bias, or if we can, just get rid of that bias completely. Like, let's make our algorithms have zero bias in them. And I'm wondering what you think of that argument, whether it's possible or whether that should be how we're thinking about bias at all.
Yeah. So first I'll say, that I think it's thinking about, like bias and wanting the goal of our work maybe is debiasing or removing bias is probably not super fruitful, because if we see there's so many different harms that systems can give rise to, different issues that systems can give rise to, right? That like, thinking about bias as like a single thing can't possibly capture them all, right? And maybe lulls us into kind of a false sense of complacency about, how good of a job we're doing, right? Because we want these to be sort of iterative processes. We always want to be on the lookout for these things. I also think there's like the way we framed bias sometimes is, also kind of misses out on some things that we're not capturing really well that we might care about. So I think one thing that's true about quote unquote bias is that it often kind of locates like problems at like the point of decision making, right, for a system, right? So all of the examples that I gave are issues of the system at the decision making time, right? The analysis that looks at how a sentiment analysis system is treating different kinds of language. And sometimes when we say, there's bias in the model or bias in the system, we want to remove that bias, we're really not thinking about questions like, this mode of analysis doesn't really help you understand how these different decisions actually impact people. Like, who is actually harmed when the system is deployed, right? How do people's lives change? And so thinking about debiasing a model in some sense, like almost, I think we risk like this. It isn't guaranteed to lead to this, but I think it risks this mode of analysis where you don't really think about what the harms are to people. And I can try to give some examples of those things where I think those, if you're interested, I think where those give rise to different questions than just like, questions right at the point of decision making.
Yeah, feel free to share those examples. I think that would be great.
Yeah. So one fun one is for speech recognition in cars. So we know that speech recognition systems work less well for people with higher pitched voices, and car makers have actually acknowledged this. So speech recognition in cars tend not to work for women as well as for men. And when I was looking this up, I found one proposed solution from car maker is, I quote, "Many issues with women's voices could be fixed if female drivers were willing to sit through lengthy training. Women could be taught to speak louder and direct their voices towards the microphone," which is both insulting but also could be catastrophic if like your voice recognition system in your car just like doesn't work when it's supposed to, right? Like you could think about this, right? Or we've also seen examples, right, where NLP systems are increasingly used in, for example, hiring contexts, right? So you can imagine resume filtering systems, but also perhaps like interview like situations, right, where your speech perhaps is being evaluated, right? And I think there are questions of what are the impacts on different groups of people, right, like when these systems are being deployed. And I also think, I think one other example that I like a lot is this example of toxicity detection systems, again, in which we know they treat mentions of disability as disproportionately toxic. We also know that these same systems treat minoritized varieties of English as more toxic than mainstream US English. So I think if you step away from thinking about just the system output and towards thinking about like what the consequences of this system deployment are, you can think of actually quite a few things that might happen, right, when this is used in content moderation systems, right? One, there's like if you're a person writing about disability or a person writing in a minoritized language variety, right, there's like the indignity and frustration of maybe your posts get deleted, right, like very often, right? So there's that immediate frustration. And there's like the accumulated impacts of these things, right? Like how does disproportionate removal of mentions of like toxicity of disability, right, impact public discourse, right? How does it make it feel like reproduce ideas that disability is not maybe an appropriate topic for public discourse, maybe on social media platforms? How does it impact people to the ability to talk about these kinds of things online in a free way, right? If these things are disproportionately removed, how does it affect efforts towards, for example, like public like recognition of like disability rights, right, and like efforts towards legislation and something. So there are kind of multiple kinds of harm that's not just the system doesn't work well for me, but also there's the dignitary harm of the system doesn't work well for me. There's like the public participation sort of harm that like other people can't see what I write, right? And we are reproducing ideas about what kinds of language, what kinds of topics are acceptable and available for public discourse. And these are important because they reproduce very old like hierarchies, right? So there are very old hierarchies that devalue minoritized or non-standard varieties of English, for example. And we risk kind of reproducing these exact same hierarchies that continue to devalue these ways of producing language.
Would you be willing to talk more about toxicity systems? Content moderation has been in the news a lot recently, and I'm just curious about how these toxicity systems work, especially through an NLP and I guess NLP bias perspective.
Yeah, so I should say, just by way of disclaimer, like my main area, I don't work on toxicity, so I'm familiar with some of the work on kind of biases or harms kind of possibly arising from toxicity detection systems, but I don't work on them. But I do think they are super important, in part because the ways the toxicity systems that are likely encountered by most consumers, the most users, as parts of content moderation systems online are actually pretty opaque to researchers. So we have some idea of how it is that they probably work. But we don't, they're largely black boxes, right? So we can only kind of examine their outputs. So I guess I'll say a couple of things. One is that these systems, like a lot of other NLP systems, right, it's like a supervised task, right? So they are trained in a way such that you gather a large data set of language that you think is toxic or abusive or offensive, and these definitions do vary, and there are consequences to these different definitions of what we think is harmful language. But largely you gather this data. It is usually annotated, so perhaps by crowd workers, is like one often common paradigm, right, for whether or not this language is hateful or abusive or toxic, and then you train systems on this text. There are a lot of, I think one thing that's really important and interesting to me is that there are tons of design decisions, right, that go into this process that really affect the outcome. For example, if how do you get the data set that you're training on in the first place? How do you just, if you say, I need a data set of abusive or toxic or hateful language, how do you get this? One way, you can imagine, right? One way to do this is by keyword searches, right? But this sort of like limits what you can train your model on to things that are like very overtly hateful in ways that you already know about. You could ask for, things that people have previously reported perhaps as hateful, right? But this might also constrain what you get in some way, right? And it's maybe dependent on what people have reported and like what the affordances of the larger like content moderation like system are, whatever. And so all of these things kind of have, and these things and also who your annotators are and what their experiences are will affect this. I think one other thing that's useful to note is that there are, I alluded to this when I mentioned definitions of toxicity or hate speech or whatever matter a lot. And they do because harmful language, right, on social media platforms or other places can take a lot of different forms. And so what you consider within the purview of your system, right, changes from system to system, and that's important to think about. So most systems consider very overtly hateful language, use of slurs. Things like microaggressions are really hard, both because it's hard to get a data set of them, it's just subtle language, right? It's much more difficult to, just to pinpoint them as hateful things. There are other things that are very like sort of forum dependent, or location dependent. So right, in general, like talking about like bodies is not harmful, but in like some like maybe like forums dedicated to like survivors of eating disorders, it is harmful, right? And that's prohibited. Okay, so that's like very specific. So all of these things contribute to the challenges of developing, appropriate and effective toxicity systems. And I think the last thing I want to say is that I think it's really important to think about these systems in the context of the larger content, larger systems that they form a part of, right? So there's usually like a larger content moderation system, right, of which the NLP portion is only like a small portion, right? There's like some model that does something, but that operates as part of a larger system that can look like a lot of different things, right? Users have many different ways of reporting hate speech. There are lots of actions user might be able to take, right? Like there might be the consequences you might choose for, for people, are different, right? Sometimes the decision is I'm going to delete hateful posts, and sometimes the decision is I'm just going to quarantine you for a while or post, so like it's how appropriate or like a good a job a toxicity system does also has to be considered like kind of in the context of like whatever kind of holistically whatever this larger system is. And I think that's also kind of like a mode of analysis that that maybe we underutilize in NLP, but not, for example, in HCI and social computing, where folks have been thinking about these things for quite a long time.
I've been having some conversations recently about AI systems that exist in very complex environments and whether or not they're actually useful. And so when you're talking about toxicity, I'm thinking about like ground truth labels and how it's very difficult to make an AI system when there is no ground truth to go off of. And one example that comes to mind for me of this is trying to make an AI system that predicts if people are going to be happy, because the data that goes into making that system is, labeling whether people are happy or not. And happiness is such like an arbitrary and contested thought, a word, and also experience. And so with toxicity, it's also making me think about that. Like how do we even come up with ground truth labels for toxicity? And if there's no way to avoid the inherent bias, should those systems exist in the first place? Are they still worth it? What do you think?
Yeah, totally. That is a fantastic question. And I think it is the case for lots of these complicated NLP tasks, things like toxicity or sentiment, but also things like, is my chatbot empathetic? Is this like an appropriate response? Even is this a good summary of something, right? I think there are a lot of, for I think a lot of these tasks or settings, it is almost always going to be the case that people will disagree, right? Because this is the nature of language, right? Language, like we like the way we do language, right? Like arises in our interpretations of other people's language, right? What we think language means, like comes out of all of our lived experiences, right? It's super subjective and contested sometimes. It varies a lot based on cultural and geographic context, for example, right? And so I think there's important questions about trying to make, maximally portable or scalable NLP solutions, because it is almost always the case that people will not agree, completely if something is toxic or not, right? It depends a lot on context and on your own lived experiences, right? So I think this raises a lot of questions because the NLP pipeline typically sort of like does assume like one right answer, one ground truth like label or prediction or something for everything. And so I think this raises not just questions for how you annotate, right? And maybe you just allow different answers, but also what the problem formulation is to begin with, and also then how you model it, right? Are all, do you treat all answers as equally valid, for example, right? And I think different settings, this might look different, right? For hate speech, you might decide if at least one person thinks it's harmful, maybe it just is harmful, right? Like I don't want to quibble and try to figure out whose perspective is most valid, right? But there are other things like I think one really illustrative example from like the recent kind of U.S. context is a state phrase like "all lives matter," right? Like, do you keep this in a forum or not, right? And it's like who might be harmed by having this, right? And like who's and so this is a question that's really important because like the perspectives of who is annotating for is this like harmful or appropriate or something like that matters a lot. And it may be that there's no decision you can make, right, whether to keep that in your forum or not, right, or social media platform. There's probably no decision that'll satisfy everybody, right? Some people will be upset if it's removed, and a lot of people will be harmed if it's kept up. And I think what this illustrates, right, is that I think heretofore, I think we've assumed that there is like an obviously right decision or a neutral decision for a lot of these things. I think what this illustrates, right, very starkly, is that a lot of the time there is no neutral decision, but you still have to make one. And so the question is, like, what processes do you effectively develop, right? Who's to bring in perspectives in a meaningful way, right, to make that decision. But yeah, I think this is a fantastic question, and I think it raises tons of questions like beyond just toxicity, for just like how do we do NLP at all, right? If all our models assume there's a right answer, right? And there are people thinking about this in other settings, for example, in natural language inference. So this is the task where given two sentences, right, does the first entail the second? And a lot of people sort of, don't disagree on some interpretations, right? The first sentence mentions a woman and the second mentions a girl, right? Does the first entail the second? I don't know. Some people would say yes, some people would say no, right? But it depends on your world understanding of what woman and girl means, right? Yes, I think this is like an exciting time because there are people starting to think about like, okay, these disagreements exist because, we live in the world and language is hard and complicated and contextual. How do we rethink NLP to account for this?
One thing that you mentioned is this, the mythos that language is neutral, but what we know is that language is created in like a real time and real place in like a specific context, and there's a whole, language is political to a certain degree. Like there's power behind it, even in how it's created. And I'm wondering from your perspective, how we, I guess, contend with that. Because in NLP, people are making decisions about what language means. And like you're saying, it's weighted in certain ways. And so I'm wondering if like there's a power analysis of all this, and how do we make sure that there's like either an equality of voices represented or at least a diversity of voices represented in that description or creation of power.
Yeah. So people outside of NLP have thought about this for a long time. So, I think particularly linguistic anthropologists, but also a lot of disciplines, sociolinguists, educators, and of course, like folks, whose sort of like existences, right, like, sort of by nature, like require this kind of power analysis. So, like indigenous folks, right, like Black communities, right, have, and in thinking about language, have thought about these things and written about them for a long time. And this is where I think NLP, could benefit a lot from drawing from all of this thinking. And so I think there is like considerable evidence that who gets to control language use really is a function of power, right? And so Jane Hill, who wrote this wonderful book, The Everyday Language of White Racism, one of the examples that she brings up is kind of controversies over the naming of a kind of offensive naming of like certain landmarks, right? So there was one landmark that there was like one mountain that had a name that was very offensive, and I won't say it, to like the indigenous people living there. But it had been used a long time by like the white residents, and so it's like this controversy erupted. And what Jane, what Dr. Hill really showed is that there was considerable resistance, right, to relinquishing kind of like control over the naming of this thing, right? That like, and there are all kind of arguments were proffered, like, oh, it's it's always had this like sort of offensive name, like but all these kinds of things. But really, what it came down to is, right, like, we don't want anybody to tell us that we can't call it this, right? And in this case, like, the choice of like who gets to decide like what this feature was called was really a question about like who gets to control language, right? And that has always in United States history, and I think like globally, right, placed white people at the top. And so definitely I think and there, like, for NLP systems, there is kind of emerging work thinking about how NLP systems also kind of shift power in the sense that they do kind of participate in several ways. One, they reproduce ideas about people, right, in languages, right, and those are important because those kind of support, the distributions of power and resources, right? And I can say more about that. I think another is like, for example, if your machine translation system or your Google Maps, right, like has particular names for each particular landmarks, right, in some sense, right, like that almost controls like what those things are called, right, because this is what a lot of people who go to a new place will see, right? And so this is like a kind of a stark example of technology and language use that can shift how language is used. Yeah, as far as your question about inclusion, I think inclusion is tricky, right? You've probably already thought about this a lot, right? But there is also a lot of thinking about the politics of inclusion, right? How inclusion is necessary but not sufficient, and how inclusion, right, that just brings people in, but without really meaningfully shift power, actually ends up being a thing that looks like change that isn't change, right? And it really is like hides the fact that real meaningful change hasn't happened. So I think when you think about and in both kind of like the AI technology space more broadly, and also in linguistic anthropology work, for example, there's a lot of evidence that, right, like just because you bring in different like language varieties, right, doesn't mean that you value them anymore. So we can see, right, there's great work in linguistic anthropology that shows that we might value different language varieties, right? We might value African American English, but we don't actually dismantle larger ideas about like what this variety is and who speaks it, and what we think good or standard language is. Which means that the net result has been that some people get to borrow African American English without paying the penalty for it, but people who actually speak this variety, right, don't reap any of these benefits, right? So the inclusion, just saying my system will now include this language variety, right, doesn't actually meaningfully change anything for the speakers of this language variety. I think one answer that looks very straightforward for these questions of bias or harm or whatever will look like, let's bring some more people to the table, and let's also maybe just include these other language varieties that we've ignored, right, these other communities. And there are ways to do that, right, that still don't really amount to like meaningful change, right, and that could like incur additional harms, like this kind of appropriation. So it is, I think, possible to develop processes that really meaningfully shift power, but I think we need to be very, very careful about what those look like.
Yeah, let's talk about power, actually, because we love talking about power on this show. And you did mention earlier that a lot of this has to do with the distributions of power, and what I'm guessing are probably unequal distributions of power. And one of the great things about NLP is that even though on this show we talk a lot about topics that are like highly theoretical and maybe these futuristic ideal concepts, but NLP exists today in the systems that we use all the time, like Facebook, Twitter, social media is all full of NLP. And so taking this from like theoretical to practical, what are the distributions of power that exist in the systems today?
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about how NLP systems participate in different social arrangements. So I think there's a couple of ways they can do this. I don't know if your question is about like the distributions in like how kind of these things are constructed, or in like how they affect these distributions in their outcome, but I guess I'll start with the latter and then maybe we can talk about the former. So I think there's a couple of ways that NLP systems can, and none of these should be like, are new in the sense that like these in many ways look like how language has always participated in various unjust social arrangements, right? There's just like new kind of, maybe it just looks shinier now. So one way is what I and actually other folks at MSR who really came up with this way of talking about these, which is allocational harms. So these are harms that might arise when a system when systems kind of distribute resources or opportunities, right? And so this is a lot of what like the fairness in machine learning and AI has thought about, right? Credit, hiring, this kind of thing. And I think it's entirely possible that NLP systems can participate in these kinds of things, right? So language has often acted as an institutional gatekeeper for allocating resources and opportunities, right? Who gets citizenship, who can immigrate, who gets access to good medical care, right, that they understand, who gets penalized in the educational system, right, like who gets admitted to like universities, right, all of these kinds of things, and we know that language, so we know that language is used to do these kinds of things, right? For example, the citizenship tests for lots of countries involve like a language component, and hiring has always often is implicitly or explicitly considered somebody's communication or language skills, right? So there's a possibility that I think it's likely that as NLP systems maybe get deployed in some of these contexts, that they will also kind of affect different people's access to these kinds of things differentially. The open question is, how do they do that, right? We don't actually really know where it is that NLP systems might be deployed in these settings and what the outcomes are. I think another kind of set of harms that we might think about are what we've been calling representational harms. So they're really, and I think these are maybe almost more intuitive, because in many ways language is about representing the world, right? And so representational harms can arise, right, when systems subordinate different social groups, not by differentially allocating opportunities or resources, but representing them in different kinds of ways, right? So this can happen when different groups or people are stereotyped, but also when people are erased, right? When different topics or different ways of doing different language varieties are erased from kind of public view, when people are unable to participate in public discourse, right? When certain language varieties are stigmatized, right? When you say, oh, African American English is offensive, right? Well, it's not, but it's been viewed throughout U.S. history as like a less valid form of language, right? As wrong or deficient. So, and I think it's very straightforward to see how NLP systems can participate in these kinds of things, right? Like the accumulation of a toxicity system treating mentions with disabilities toxic or treating African American English or language as toxic, right? Can very easily result in these kinds of things. I'll also note too that it's not just system output, right, that we can think about, but also just NLP systems and practices more generally, right? So the fact that resources for developing NLP systems just don't exist, right, for most of the world's languages just means that whatever harms that these technologies can give rise to, there's also tons of people who just never can't get the benefits, and those benefits are unequally distributed. So I think one thing that I think a lot about, right, is to think about how do these NLP systems participate in language in these social arrangements by perhaps helping to distribute these resources unequally. And then how do they represent people in a harmful way, or kind of recirculate or reproduce kind of very old and very pernicious, very persistent ideas about different kinds of language, different kinds of speakers.
So in 2020, we had on Dr. Emily Bender, and she kind of gave us a 101 of NLP.
Ooh, she's wonderful.
Yeah, she's great. But one thing that I've been thinking about since that interview is, to what degree are these just like problems of language and like politics of language, and to what degree are these like new issues with NLP technology? And I'm wondering from your perspective, like what's different now? Is there anything different now in this like technological space than what's happened for thousands of years in the language space?
That's a great question. Definitely, I think the root of all these things lies outside of NLP, right? The ideas that judicial systems like don't require NLP to treat like defendants who speak or witnesses who speak African American language as less valid, right? Like these things have existed for a very long time, right? And in many ways they arise out of processes of like colonization and this kind of thing, right? So they're old, and I think it is both like helpful to recognize that, sometimes frustrating, because you do feel like in many ways when you're trying to address this for NLP systems, right, it feels in some ways like stopgap measures, right? Like, Band-Aid solutions for a problem that lies outside of NLP, right? So we cannot really make equitable or just NLP systems without dismantling these larger language ideologies, right? It's just not possible. So I think things that are maybe I don't want to say unique, but maybe different about technologies is, kind of, I think, scale and perhaps an opaqueness, right? So the scale at which they operate and the difficulty of challenging them, in part because I think it's the case that most of the NLP systems that we touch on a regular basis that really users interact with are black boxes. Sometimes we're not even aware that they're operating. Like, how many NLP systems do you think, like, affect what you see in your, affecting maybe the ads that you see or your search results or, like whether or not your post made it to social media or whatever, right? Like sometimes these are not really visible to you. And I think this means that they likely have significant impact, but we cannot see that. Neither researchers nor the people who actually interact with them, right? It's really not tangible. You can't. And there's no recourse. Right, and you can't really refuse to participate effectively. So I don't think these are, in some ways, they're not brand new, right? Like the education system, right, has long kind of like participated, right, in these kinds of things, and it's also very hard, right, to challenge the education system, right? So the fact that these things that these things like persist, right, these language ideologies persist, right, because like they're institutionalized because institutions reproduce them, right, has meant that there's always been some degree of opaqueness and scale and that they're very difficult to challenge. But I think technology takes it to perhaps a new level. But that is a great question, and I'll probably be mulling it over this whole afternoon after this.
So to wrap up, Su Lin, for those of us who are either NLP researchers or just NLP consumers, whether we realize it or not, because this is such a complex issue that is largely hidden from all of us, like you were just saying, do you have any advice for how we can keep a healthy dose of optimistic skepticism when it comes to NLP systems? What do you do?
But I think, I think one thing, right, is to be kind of attentive, like just, people are talking about this, right? So one thing I've seen this actually, like, this is brand new, right, since like, kind of recently, is people are talking about this, and like these issues specifically related to large language models and similar things have actually made it right into public discourse because, for example, of the wonderful work by Tim Nint and like Gabru and Margaret Mitchell, and also their treatment by Google, right, and all these things. These things have made it into the news, and I think this like represents like kind of an important, like a significant moment, right? The fact that like these things, these language models exist at all, right? The fact that they actually like underpin a lot of products, like across a lot of companies, the kind of, so the fact of their existence and the harms that they can give rise to, and the fact that they made it into public discourse, for me, I think represents like a really important moment. And I think it is possible for people to put pressure on these companies, particularly folks working for these companies, right? It is possible to put pressure on them. But I think like broadly, the landscape needs to change in a way that makes it possible both for us to dramatically change like who's at the table, and also kind of what we know about these systems operating in the first place, right? And I think it is really impossible to make sense of the social implications of these systems, right? To even be appropriately skeptical or optimistic or whatever, right? Without even knowing what the landscape looks like. And I think, what we need to do, both as technologists and as consumers, right, is to push for, much better accounting of this landscape and like where kind of these systems, like, where they touch us, and in order to think about alternatives.
And Su Lin, for folks who want to follow up on some of these ideas or join this conversation or just reach out to you, how can folks do that?
Yeah, please email me. Please get in touch with me at sulin.blodgett@microsoft.com. I also have a website. Papers are there. But I, as you can probably tell, love talking about this, and would love to talk about it with anybody who wants to get in touch. So thank you.
Su Lin, thank you so much again for coming on this show, and we will be sure to include all those links and many more in our show notes. But for now, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
We want to thank Dr. Su Lin Blodgett again so much for joining us today for this wonderful conversation. And Dylan, let's start with you. What is your immediate reaction?
Yeah, I really loved this conversation because although we were talking about bias specifically in natural language processing systems, we were also talking about what it might mean to create a universal language or a universal definition for a phenomenon that might be experienced in such subjective ways. And for me, again, coming from a philosophy background and also in like human-computer interaction, it's like this is one of those thorny things. It's like, whoa, how do you take this concept of bias and then actually do something with it? Because I think it's so easy to say, oh yeah, there's bias over there, let's just get rid of that thing. Like, let's not look at our social anything. Let's just say, oh, okay, bias is in our technology, let's get rid of it, which we've talked about before on the show, why that isn't necessarily the way to go. And in this conversation, I think Su Lin really parsed out some of the difficulties in how you actually design for bias and for a diversity of definitions around bias. But what about you, Jess? What did you come out of this interview thinking about?
Honestly, pretty similar thoughts to you. I think this is like...
Great minds think alike.
Some say. This is a reoccurring theme that I think we've seen quite a bit on this show and just in the field of AI ethics and responsible technology, is this issue with trying to take something that is qualitative and societally based in nature, like something that is so subjectively human, and then attempting to quantify it so that we can feed it into models. and make predictions with it and do whatever we will with it computationally. And I think that this is just such a perfect example of how something so subjective, like even defining if a word is toxic or not, or stating whether a human is happy or not, things that are so obviously subjective are being fed into models. And these models are assuming that there is a right answer, like Su Lin was saying, or these models are assuming that there is a neutral answer or a, quote, true answer. And sometimes in life, because humans are so ridiculously complex, that's just not possible. And so now we're dealing with the impacts and the aftermath of like attempting to turn something that is inherently unneutral and subjective into something that is seemingly neutral and objective. And there's clearly a lot of harm and unintentional consequences that come with this.
And let's talk about toxicity, because for me, that was one of the most interesting parts of the conversation, especially in terms of machine learning algorithms categorizing microaggressions. So like, how can a NLP system really categorize toxicity in the first place? And especially when there are certain words like deaf, or certain elements around like maybe mental illness, and those immediately put this like toxic red flag up for the system, when maybe within the context it's like the most healing thing, non-toxic thing possible for the users. And again, this goes back into like human-centered design. What does it actually mean to have algorithms that respond to real context in real time, so there isn't this damage done by saying, okay, here's this sweeping statement. But again, we get to this microaggression part where you're like, okay, but even if you take the machine out of it, like, I would not say that society, quote unquote society, as if it could be one single thing, has come to terms with what like a common definition around microaggressions, or at the very least, there are different camps around what a microaggression consists of, depending on identity, depending on context, etc. And so now we're asking this machine algorithm to categorize based off of that. And Su Lin, I think, did an awesome job unpacking why that is so difficult. Jess, what do you think about toxicity?
I think it's really toxic.
Yeah. It's well said.
Just same amount of toxicity as the
That's
person
a hot
next to me,
take.
except
That's a hot take.
not actually. So I completely agree with you, and I think this is kind of like the crux of the issue that we were getting at with Su Lin today, was that these things are incredibly contextual. And so what I was saying before with like the human nature of subjectivity, there's certain things that humans just disagree on, and that's because they're super subjective. And I think toxicity is definitely one of those things. I mean, I don't think that. I'm pretty sure that we've proven that toxicity is one of these weird, subjective, sticky areas. And it's not just that maybe me and you, Dylan, might differ on what we agree a word to be, like the level of toxicity that a word might be. It's also like me and myself as a human, I might look at a word and think that it's not toxic. And then I might look at that same word 10 years later, and based off of my lived experiences, I might think it's toxic again. And so that was like the heart of the question that I was asking Su Lin about toxicity and ground truth labels, is that like, if we are building systems to guess when something is going to be toxic, or to guess when something is a microaggression or hate speech or whatever it is, assuming that there's no human in the loop here, this is just like a purely automated decision, there really is no, quote, ground truth. There is no way that we can label this word as being actually toxic, or this word as being actually not toxic. We can't even make a sliding scale of the level of toxicity that it might fall, like whichever range it might fall into, because it is so inherently subjective. And so it's just getting back at the same issue that we were talking about before, where we don't really have a ground truth or a neutral or a quantifiable label that we can give these things that need to be labeled to work in these algorithms. And I come back to this quote that Su Lin said during this interview that I thought was just like spot on. She said, "A lot of the time there is no neutral decision, but you still have to make one." And so that's where I'm kind of sitting now after this conversation, is thinking like, okay, this feels a little bit hopeless to try to quantify all of these things that are so subjective and to deal with all the unintended consequences and the negative impacts. But we have to make a decision somewhere. So what do we do?
Everything you just said, Jess, brings us back to some of the main research questions of the Radical AI podcast, especially around ethics and morality. So we have this subjective space, and then we have this possibly more objective space, and then like what do we do with it? And then what do designers do with it? Because we can't have this like just radical subjectivity, because that, as Su Lin said, you have to actually do something, right? Like we have these systems, they're out there, and so now we actually need to stake our claim on what is going to be embedded in them. But we also can't say that, okay, this is toxic and this is not, because what ends up happening is that the people in positions of privilege and power end up embedding, the status quo concepts of what is toxic, which makes it so that people who are already either marginalized or decentralized in that space or in that system get further decentered. And so the question is, right, like what to do. And I think Su Lin's work brings us to the brink of how we do those things, which I think is the next step. But I mean, is this different, right? Is this different than what we deal with on an everyday basis in terms of language? And that's a question I still have, is like, is there something that makes NLP, like the fact that it's a machine and not a human, like there's still language, right? There's still this processing of language and the way that humans process language. It's still like capsules of metaphor and images and all of this stuff. So I'm still curious about whether these are the same issues at the societal level, like the human societal level, and then the NLP level, or is there something unique about this NLP systems that we need to think differently about than we do about language in our general context?
I'm not going to speak for everyone because I'm not an NLP expert, but I have written NLP algorithms before. And so I will say from my subjective experience that I definitely stand in the camp that natural language processing algorithms, and any algorithm for that matter that uses data, historical data of any kind, to make its decisions or to do whatever it's going to do, it has the same problems that humans have because the data is human data. And so I don't think that just because we're automating these decisions or we're plugging them into a machine that all of a sudden all of our subjectivity can now be taken away, all of our bias can be mitigated and zeroed out. Like that, I just think that's not possible. And so I really appreciate Su Lin's work and Emily Bender and all the other people in this space who are like really focusing in on the issues with NLP bias and ethics in general, because I think a lot of people do assume that these systems are neutral and they do assume that they have no political or vested interest, when in reality, that's impossible given the data that's fed into them.
Neutrality is a myth.
We should put that as our tagline. Radical AI. Neutrality is a myth.
We should put that as the title for this episode. We'll see what the title ends up being. No, I think your points are really well taken though, Jess. And I think that even if like the problem of maybe say bias or language in the human social world versus the robotic NLP world, even if they're the same, then my next question is like, well, then are the solutions to that the same? Which I don't know. I don't even know what solution looks. Maybe solution isn't even the framework that we should look at, because that's what got us in this like rabbit hole of, well, we need to get rid of bias completely. And so maybe Su Lin's more nuanced view of this can be a beacon of hope and light for us and for developers and designers out there who are working with these immensely complex systems of language and NLP.
And hopefully that beacon of light is enough for us to call it for this episode. Maybe we'll have a part 3 on NLP bias. We'll see. How deep can we dive on this issue? But for more information on today's show, please visit the episode page at radicalai.org.
And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, we invite you, yes, you, to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher. Catch our new episodes every other week on Wednesdays. Join our conversation on Twitter at RadicalAIPod. And as always, stay radical.